My name is David Walls. I am the curatorial assistant here at the Columbia Museum of Art. My job consists mainly of supporting the entire curatorial department. It could be things as simple as finding out information in our online collections database, but it could also be something like writing a full dossier on an artist for research purposes. I'm really excited to talk about Interior Lives. I had worked on it previously as a curatorial intern as a graduate student of art history at USC, and to come back now as a full-time employee, being able to have the opportunity to come in and seeing the full breadth of it all is really special. I, like every other art student there at USC, was tasked with coming to the museum and choosing an artwork in the permanent collection galleries to write about. When I walked into Gallery 18 and looked over to the right, there I saw it. This amazing work called The Jam by Albert Jean Camille, made sometime in the 1940s. And not only was it just a beautiful painting visually, but its subject matter really stood out among the rest. Roller derby is not something you see in painting very much at all, even today. I wanted to understand how Camille really worked, how he operated in thinking about that subject and why it was important. And so that led me to a broader discussion of work being created at that time in California, which is actually where he made the work. And so I kind of noticed this very common theme of recreational subject matter and how that was being used to really reflect and comment upon larger issues in the state's changing cultural landscape at the time. So not just roller derby, but also surfing, things really distinct to California, but also things in general that are dealing with more leisurely or recreational activities. To see a work that means a lot to me and to my academic career presented in a new context is also very important, and it makes me feel like I've done important research and that it's actually being seen.
You're listening to Binder. I'm your host, Ray McManus. Hey, welcome back to Binder. I'm Ray, in case you forgot about me. It's been a little while. Drew and I took a little time, spend with family and friends for the holidays, and super excited to get back into this and start recording new episodes for the next season. And I am so excited that I asked Drew if for at least the first few minutes, if he would not go in the booth and stay here with me in the studio, because I've missed you, buddy.
Hey, man, I've missed you too. It has been too long. And you braved a horrible, nasty day, horrible weather here in South Carolina just to come hang out with me.
You're worth every bit of it, man.
You know what? I appreciate that.
But only in South Carolina, right? I mean, we just went through, 2 days ago, it was like in the 70s.
Yeah.
And then the last 2 days was cold, and then the day is cold and rainy, which I think is a little apropos.
It is. Well, museums, we thrive on the worst weather conditions.
Right.
We're always our busiest when it's the worst outside. So I pray for days like this.
Right.
Because we need you to come inside. And you're right, it is apropos, because today we're talking about a new exhibition that we've opened here at the museum that's all about the inside. It's called Interior Lives, Modern American Spaces, 1890 to 1945. It's basically looking at American life in the early 20th century, but using interiors and objects as a way to kind of tell that story. You know, we spent a lot of the 20th century kind of using objects as a way to define ourselves. I mean, it's a clout thing, right? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, we still do that. If you have an Apple Watch, you're really saying something about who you are as a person, right?
Or you are just so monochromatic that, everything must be linked together because you're scared to death you're going to miss one meeting, which is, for me, it's not a status symbol necessarily. It fits with my iPhone, I guess. But no, you're totally right. I think it's even more so today. Of course, we use objects to indicate some sort of wealth status, whether we have it or not. So the cars we drive, the things we carry around with us and display to our friends or to strangers, There are some necessities for those things, but mostly it's for show.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think it goes beyond just like class and wealth, right? Like sometimes it's just like you collect certain objects because it kind of says something about your own personal identity, right?
Sure.
Like I have a ton of records. And you know what that says about me?
That you love albums?
That I am a millennial hipster who has no sense and too much storage. That's what it says about me. But, beyond that, I mean, sometimes you keep things because you want to say something about yourself, and sometimes it's like an heirloom kind of thing, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
Like I recently, I'm going to announce this on the podcast. I've never said this on the podcast, but I'm actually getting married here in a couple of months. And my fiance's uncle wasn't able to join us, but over Christmas, he brought a handcrafted chest. Like a wedding chest that he made for us.
Cool.
And then immediately was like, this will look great in your grandchildren's houses later in life. Which is hilarious. But like,
no pressure.
But, I think that is like a good point. And like in the show, there's a lot of objects that are kind of like heirlooms at this point. Like they're handed down from family member to family member. And they kind of tell that story of their family and why they collected these objects and what it says about them. I mean, do you have anything in your house that you think defines you in a way?
Yeah. I mean, inanimate objects, there's other objects that are living that define me, but I mean, books. And not just books for books' sake, but like these are the books that I have read or that they've had an influence or an impact on me at any point in my life. And so kind of like with albums, right, with LPs, if somebody sees that collection and they're looking through and they see the kinds of music you tend to collect or the music you tend to listen to, it says something about yourself. And they could say the same thing about the books that they see in my offices. And then, to thinking of heirlooms, I have acquired two rather antique guns, like an 1864 Springfield, that was probably fell from somebody in the Civil War and somebody picked it up and carved their initials in it and got passed down to me, and a rifle that was supposedly captured in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. They hang on the wall. I'm not some, gun nut or anything like that. But because there's something about the historical impact of what I've got and I'm holding. And plus, I also like it when people come in and they see, this giant musket with a bayonet on it, and they're wondering, what's the deal with this guy, But it's kind of it's cool. It survived all this time. So regardless of where this chest ends up that you've been given, if it goes to your one day children or grandchildren or whatever, it doesn't matter. The fact that, it should survive the test of time unless you're just super destructive, Drew. But with it, there's stories around it, right? And the fact that it's handmade, it has a deeper story to it. Because a box is utilitarian, right? A gun is, well, obviously it has its intended purposes. And neither one of us are necessarily using these things for those reasons, but we'll hold on to them, right? So yeah, it's weird how objects can define us, but sometimes we just hang on to some objects just for whatever reason. I mean,
yeah,
we just like them.
That's true. Someone who knows a lot more about objects, especially the objects in this show, would probably be the curator for this exhibition.
He might know a few things, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we could bring him in because he's definitely more of an expert on this than I am. Though I appreciate the invitation to be here, Ray. It's always nice to see you.
Well, it's always great to see you, Drew. I'm excited for some of the shows we've got planned. And yeah, let's listen to Michael. Let's not keep him waiting. Well, we are here with Michael Neumeister. Michael, remind our listeners who you are and what you do.
I am the senior curator at the Columbia Museum of Art, where I've been for, I guess it's over 2 years now. And so I'm not only in charge of the oversight of the collections, but also in organizing and presenting exhibitions like this one.
Wow. It's been 2 years?
Yeah, I know.
That does not feel like it's been 2 years. I think last time we had you on...
we probably talked about the Tina Brewer show.
Yep, exactly. But we're here today to talk about a brand new exhibit that we have downstairs, Interior Lives, Modern American Spaces, 1890 to 1945, that explores everyday Americans, where they lived, worked, played, evolved, sort of their identities, if you will, in the first half of the 20th century. I know you can speak much more eloquently about it than I just did. But I'd like to know first, before we even get into that, what inspired you to really want to put this thing together?
Yeah, it's funny. Before I came to the CMA, I was in New York, and I was actually working from home for 2 years in the midst of COVID.
Fun times.
Yeah, well, really interesting, and times that really made you reassess what it meant to be at home. And especially in that moment where the world, by all accounts, the world was falling apart outside. And those of us who were fortunate enough to work from home were just kind of sitting there and unable to exist in the way that we had. And like I'm a millennial, and millennials all started to buy houseplants. Like, this became a thing. And there's all these new trends that are happening. I didn't buy any plants, but but a lot of people just sort of looked around and people moved. I moved, my apartment was too small all of a sudden,
Right.
and I had to find somewhere else. And I moved within New York. People moved across regions. I mean, and ultimately I did do that, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I really began to think about, what are the historical sources of this? And was there a moment in history that was analogous in some ways? Well, the modern period in America, kind of preceded by the second industrial revolution in the Gilded Age, really was similar. First of all, there was a pandemic. And,
That's right.
The Spanish flu was a big deal. And then, you start thinking about it, and you're going through artistic sources, and like, how are artists representing those crazy changes in their world? And what I really found, and it was partly through the CMA's collection that inspired this angle, was that it was subtly engaged, right? It wasn't necessarily overt or direct. And I think that the most interesting places for me as an art historian, an Americanist, and a curator was looking at kind of the more intimate scenes of people's everyday life and thinking about the things behind those scenes that are implicit in them, and sort of artists are recording the effects of the changing world in very subtle ways. And maybe they're not even intentionally doing it, but they are recording the world.
Oh, yeah. I think folks often forget that art and literature, as it's being produced, immediately becomes a social artifact. And so, it gives us another element beyond the historical textbook, beyond just sort of this fact-based approach to history, but one that will tap into feelings, one that gets us to sort of be able to see the connections. And that's one of the things that I love about this particular exhibit, because even though it is focused on a particular time period, so much of it is still appropriate today. I think when I first heard the title of this exhibit, I was like in my head trying to conceptualize what you were actually going to be doing, and I was like, I don't interior spaces like our guts. I was really way too interior. And then when I saw it, I was like, oh, yeah, because there's so much of who we are and how we are identified.
Well, I think in interpreting it in the way that you did initially is actually part of it, right? Like it's supposed to be an exploration of physical interiors and interiority and the ways that those things balance or don't balance, or how architectural space affects inner life, and the things that we do, as a conversation between our surroundings and ourselves, which is really kind of exactly what it is. And to your point, the things that we see happening in that first part of the 20th century are still very familiar. This is the moment where modernity kind of springs forth.
Right.
And it's not that it comes from nowhere, but it happens really fast.
Yes.
Things move very quickly, and people begin to see consumer objects in different ways because they become more affordable. Their design changes radically. And people start thinking of themselves differently too because of the way that the world is changing. And this greater sense of individualism, this greater sense of, well, women entering the workforce, and also like radical change in demographics. Immigration is happening at an incredible pace. So yeah, it's just like it's utterly transformative. And yet at the same time, and I think I really tried to articulate this in the last gallery of the show, people are still living.
Yeah.
You know?
Which is good to be reminded of.
Yeah, people are still living, but they're still living in ways that are both traditional and contemporary. And there's a tension there, but it's a subtle one.
Sure. Just as we see these things happening in the turn of the century, we just kind of went through that with the huge technology boom and all the things that have created a sort of tension among us.
And there's a generational tension there too that you're kind of landing on. In our time, it's in the way that technology is used, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I'm sort of blissfully ignorant of TikTok and what that means, but I am conscious, to some degree that it's like completely changing the way people interact with the internet and maybe each other. And it's sort of, in a critical stance, I think the immediacy of the video and sort of the impact that has on the way that you perceive yourself and you perceive other people, to me is kind of scary. But like, obviously, I'm not of that generation, right? Because I'm describing it as such. And there's a work in the show by an artist named Frank Beesdick. It's called The Old Victorian, and it's a lithograph from 1939. And it's just that. It's a portrait of an elderly woman in this big old 19th century hat and sort of the kind of person that you would envision literally clutching her pearls. And it is kind of about, I think, that tension, that intergenerational tension, whereas in 1939, like nothing of this woman's experience from 50 years prior had any resonance to the next generation.
Right.
And that just happened so quickly.
Yeah. And I mean, in that particular, all the way up until 1950, you're talking about massive changes, right? Massive changes to a point where I think for any of our generations from, Gen X on up, it's hard for us to imagine, but that there could be somebody alive that can recall a time when even the most rudimentary parts of technology that we have long since abandoned because we've moved on didn't even have that. And then you throw in on top of the Spanish flu and all of that, then you've got these massive wars, all of these things that are all happening and transformative to a psyche is sort of well captured in these quieter moments. Because again, the textbook are always the big things, always the more monumental aspects of historical trajectory. And yet what we're looking at here is more of those quieter moments.
Yeah. And, it's not that the textbooks are quote unquote wrong, but if you get a list of bullet points about what it was like to live in the 1920s, you're going to get a decline of nuclear families. You're going to get intergenerational households are becoming extinct. People are more and more secular and less religiously oriented and all of this stuff. And then, you look at some of the work and it's like, well, here's a church scene from, and here's, people living in very much similar ways that they've always done. And sure, and the artists have recorded the subtle differences that are around the subjects of their paintings, but the subjects of their paintings are still interacting in a way that is deeply traditional and only informed by the present.
Yeah.
Not dictated by it.
Right. I like that. That's good. It's informed, but not dictated. Let's talk about the actual exhibit itself. So when people walk in, there are the novels there, right there in the beginning. And I'd love to hear, what you're doing there with literature and sort of what was ways, maybe some strategies or even ideas on how you wanted to group these together and why that was so important.
Sure, yeah. Well, to begin at the beginning, the title wall, we decided to put a painting on the title wall. And after really thinking about it, I landed on Raphael Sawyer's Entering the Studio. It's from about 1935. It's from the CMA's collection. That painting to me was so resonant with all of the themes in the show that While it couldn't have fit neatly in every single theme, in the Venn diagram of them, it was in all of them. So it's called Entering the Studio. It's actually a portrait of Sawyer's wife and around the 1930s, amidst the Great Depression, of course. And again, that's not articulated directly. What you get through, the use of light and shading, and the figure is awash in this yellowish haze, and she has this sort of tentative expression peering into a room which extends far beyond the frame of the canvas. You get the sense that this is a painting about a relationship in a family that is maybe experiencing some hardship and maybe experiencing some tension there. And what is the tension about? Well, it seems like Raphael Sawyer, the artist, is in his studio working well into the night, and she's kind of maybe checking on him or just maybe seeing, if he needs something. Or maybe she needs something. So I think that hopefully sets the stage, and then you walk into the first gallery. It's called How the Upper Half Lives, and I wanted to create this kind of dramatic back and forth between the owners of the means of production, who are kind of represented in the first gallery, and the workers and sort of the lay people and just normal people just living their lives in the second gallery, which is called Labor, Leisure, and Liminal Space. And so in the first gallery, to your point, you'll see Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner's novel called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. It's published in 1873, and it's actually the literary source from which the name Gilded Age derives. That is a Mark Twainism, which is something that I didn't really realize until beginning to research this show. And it's one of those books that is very difficult to read in the 21st century because it's almost exclusively dialogue. This sort of rapid pace, back and forth, very loosely defined plot. It's a book that you can, pick up and read maybe 5 different pages in 5 different sections and understand exactly what it is. It's critical commentary on the sorry state between a nation and its politics, corruption in government, boss tweedisms, and so on. It's quite charming, actually, and we opened it to it's illustrated, too, although the artists are not named in the edition, which I think is kind of interesting. And the illustrations kind of speak so much to that relationship between text and image, I think, is so kind of critical to understanding the author's intention. So we have that helping to orient that gallery. And, that gallery has a bunch of really lush paintings, but also Gorham silver. And an incredible early 20th century Lenox tea set and a Seth Thomas clock. And these are all status symbols. And there's a through line in the show of the relationships between objects and personas that are teased out and the way that those are facilitated according to class. And in the second gallery, you immediately sort of see scenes of work and these factory scenes, but also scenes of leisure and maybe scenes of respite. There are lots of scenes of women at work in different contexts. One of them is a switchboard operator, which is a wonderful painting on loan from the Westmoreland Museum. And in the third gallery, it's called Objects and Personas, which sort of is the modernist moment where decorative arts and design is totally inspired by the machine age, and it's also totally inspired by the way that people live, which is a contrast to the 19th century, which is sort of design and Victorian ideas around design are sort of, it's implied that one ought to cultivate a sense of moralism. Whereas in the 20th century, it's about individualism, and that you see that through the objects on view. And some of the paintings as well, where this wonderful Aaron Bowrod self-portrait, where he pictures himself at an easel painting in front of a group of people who are sort of looking on in a very critical sense. He must be thinking, what are the expectations of an artist in 1943? How has that changed since 1890 with William Merritt Chase and sort of different conceptions of that? The final section in the exhibition is called Faith, Family, and Community, and it's just sort of what we had described, the intimacy and the subtlety of lived experience in the face of incredible change.
Those particular themes, like as a writer, like this hits on major themes that I would work through. So any of my writer friends out there, I would encourage you to come bring a notebook and come in and see these galleries. I know we've talked a little bit about it, but I think it's appropriate to kind of come back to it, especially after thinking about the way that the exhibition is broken up into the themes. I think that there is, an obvious attention to class relations. And I would love, maybe we could talk a little bit about how that's shifting at that time, and then how that sort of relates to the world we live in today.
Yeah, I think certainly class was an undergirding principle in developing the ideas around this show. And at that time, I mean, my data could be wrong, but I believe like the 1% at that time were, in today's dollars, there was even greater disparity in wealth. If you think of people like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and so on, like these incredibly rich tycoons, basically. We tried to really juxtapose that by contextualizing it with a Jacob Riis photograph, which we reproduced on the wall, just to kind of make the point that immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, I mean, my family came in this time period as so many others did, especially New Yorkers. They all landed in New York Harbor, right?
Right.
They lived in deplorable conditions. I mean, and that was that expose in the 1890s by Riis and then others following him really led to those progressive social reforms in the ensuing decades that were very much dovetailing with women's suffrage and, other sort of social justice movements in the early 20th century. I think that in America, people don't really like to talk about it.
Right.
I think even today, it's still, well, I guess with the Occupy movement maybe 10 years ago, we were more attuned to it publicly. But even then, it was very much like, it's you and it's us, where it's not just you and us, actually. There's real stratification.
Right.
There's real difference in class and economics, and it informs the way people move through the world.
Yes. I mean, well, in here, in the South in particular, class has always been sort of, plowed under to other aspects. Oftentimes clouds so much of how we understand race, clouds so much of how we understand basic economics, the exploitation of workers. Because also during this time, you've got massive labor movement happening, right? And so some of the things that we go with today that we understand, the 40-hour work week, not having to make our 6- and 7-year-olds go work in the mill somewhere. Right. All of that is also happening at this time. And so you've got those folks that are in these probably a fraction of the 1% that is, has this massive amount of wealth is having to somehow justify that for the first time whereas before it was like, come out to my summer home. It's the entire island off of Georgia, so
right.
I mean, so these sort of shifts are all taking place. I mean, it truly is, if you think about it, probably because it just kind of sort of gets overshadowed a little bit by afterwards World War I, World War II, and then, of course, all the crazy stuff that happens in the 50s, 60s, that we forget that this is very much an integral part of defining who we are now is happening during this time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's kind of the crux of the reason why I wanted to view this period through kind of quotidian subjects rather than, these advanced sort of history paintings or abstractions or something like that. It had to be representational and it had to be real to us, I think, to really make the point.
Michael Neumeister is the senior curator at the Columbia Museum of Art. The CMA's exhibition, Interior Lives, Modern American Spaces, 1890 to 1945, is on view now through May 12th. Coming up on the program,
I think about things too that are like important to me and like where would they go? Like when I die, who gets this? And will they value it in the same way that I do?
Writer David Joy, after this.
I can remember shooting this documentary for PBS.
And action.
And the premise was that I was told to tell the story of this place. And what I told them was that it's not my story to tell, but I'll introduce you to the people whose it is. And so I took him to an old black AME church, or I took him to a Cherokee writer, and she took us to Gadua Mound. And I took him to all these different places. And I remember at the end of a week recognizing an unintentional thread that ran through all of it was the idea of erasure and displacement. And I can remember just clear as day having this very real recognition that the story of all places, or the history of all places, is a story of displacement.
So I'm here with my good friend and writer David Joy, who is beaming in to us here from Western North Carolina. David, I've been a fan of your work for years, ever since Where All Light Tends to Go, your first novel. And I think that's kind of where, you met me, I think, probably through Punch. But, one of the things that I absolutely love about you is your attention to people and place, and especially people and place in the area that you're most familiar with, and an area of the South that often gets mislabeled, misunderstood, or most people just don't know anything about at all. And you bring it to life in so many disturbingly wonderful ways. But it's a pleasure to have you on this show today, to be able to talk a little bit about place and to talk about the spaces that we occupy as humans, as writers, in the areas that we're in. And all of this, of course, is coinciding with sort of a new exhibit that we're having here at the Columbia Museum of Art called Interior Lives, Modern American Spaces. Now, granted, it's set in 1890 to 1945, but so much of the stuff that comes out in this exhibit really, I think, is appropriate for what we're seeing today, and things that you have seen and have written and spoken about in such a beautiful fashion in the past several years. So welcome to Binder.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
So for our listeners, talk about a little bit about where you are, because your books are set all kind of around in this particular area, and why that's important.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in the foothills of North Carolina. I'm a 12th generation North Carolinian on my father's side. And, his first ancestor comes into what would become Bertie County, North Carolina in the late 1600s, kind of by mid 1700s, Revolutionary War, early 1800s. All of my father's family had kind of set up around the Catawba River Valley. That's where I was born. So I grew up very rooted to place there. I think what happened initially was that I watched that place start to disappear over the course of my life, to the point that now it is very much that Gertrude Stein idea that there is no there. Like I can't take you back to where I grew up. It doesn't exist. But so at 18 years old, I moved to the mountains. I moved basically 100 miles west from where I grew up. And I wound up in Jackson County, North Carolina. And at this point, I've been here, a little over half of my life. A lot of times people want to say that I write Appalachian literature, or that I write about Appalachia, which, in some ways is true, but something that I've always been very adamant and specific about is the fact that the only thing I know is Jackson County, right? And like Jackson County is not the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky or West Virginia. I don't know Appalachia as a whole. I don't speak to Appalachia as a whole. I don't wish to try to do that. And so all of my work has been set very specifically here. And I think that I understand this one particular place very well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I love about with your work, and I think something that kind of ties into some of the themes that are happening in this exhibit, is the way in which class is informed by place and vice versa. And, you and I both kind of grew up in obviously vastly different areas. Land I live on is much flatter, but from a socioeconomic standpoint, very similar. An exploitation of the working class up to, whether there were mills that moved in and then moved out, or the idea of places that you knew when you were younger are gone and have been grossly redeveloped, almost to the point where it's completely unrecognizable. It almost looks like giant strip malls, pretty much, where I grew up. How do you reconcile with that, living there, writing about it, but knowing that it's just, because it's disappearing in front of your very eyes?
I think for a long time I was very angry, especially like young me, so like 18-year-old me. I think about a writer like Edward Abbey, who I loved, and I think about a novel like The Monkey Wrench Gang, and there's this character in that, this very militant environmentalist character named Hayduke, and young 18-year-old me would turn his name into a verb, which is that I would look at the development and I would say, I want to Hayduke that, I want to burn it down. I want to take a bulldozer to it. And I was very angry about it. And I think, as I've aged, I think a lot of that has simmered down and I understand things differently. I can remember being 20 years old and I looked at people who were born and raised in these mountains, whose families had been in these mountains, for 150 years, who were a part of the construction that was erasing the place that belonged to them. And to me, I couldn't understand it. And as time has gone on, it became, you start to realize that it was out of necessity. In order for one thing to be there, something else had to move.
Right.
And that there's this constant turning of the tide. And I was left with this question of whether or not the reason I'm so bothered with it right now, is it because it's my culture? Is it because it's my culture that's being erased? Is that why I'm bothered? And ultimately, the answer was no, that it bothers me just as much to see a place like Brooklyn be gentrified and erased. And at the end of the day, it's that my greatest fear in this world is to have to live in a state of homogeny. And that's what we're losing. We're losing all of the things that give places flavor. I don't want to live in a world where somebody from Maine doesn't sound like they're from Maine. I don't want to live in a world where hash doesn't taste like it came from Edgefield County, South Carolina. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
I don't want to live in a world where people in Jackson County don't sound like they're from Jackson County. Like that, we're losing language, we're losing food, we're losing everything. And that ultimately has become kind of the background of all of my work.
I'm with you, brother, 110%. I totally agree with you. I do feel like we are in a constant swell of erasure. And do you feel like you are able to at least capture or at least grab a snapshot so that even though the things around it are going to change, even though the characters may be fictional, but the characters are surviving or living through a particular place, they are talking a particular way, so no matter what changes, you've at least preserved that?
Yeah. And I can say that initially it was never intentional. It was never something that I set out to do.
Right.
And then as time has gone on, you start to recognize that some of the things you've written aren't there anymore. There have been places that I wrote into novels that did not exist by the time the novel came out. And so they do, the work does kind of become this unintentional time capsule where it's preserving things. And I think there's value in that. I don't know that will ever be something that I'm like intentionally doing or consciously trying to do. I think it just inevitably becomes an element of the work because it has to.
Right. Right. Otherwise, it wouldn't be real. I mean, even in fiction, I mean, and you're talking about Little Canada, you're talking about Cashiers, you're talking about Cullowhee. I mean, these are actual places. And one of the things that I was really struck by in your last novel, the latest novel, I should say, I hope to God it ain't your last novel, but in your latest novel really articulates, I think, a lot of what I have struggled to try to articulate with the way in which class and race, especially here in the South, oftentimes gets mashed in together to the point where it's mashed in together so that it ends up becoming separated, if that even makes sense. And I thought it was sort of really well put in the situation. Now, I don't want to give away the book, so I want folks to be able to read it. But with Coggins and trying to understand or trying to help explain how he didn't come from any kind of privilege. It wasn't anything like that, but yet so much of our construction has been built on that. And yet we've gotten to a point now where working class whites and working class African Americans almost aren't seen as one and the same, even though they both are working class, because they're different, because one's African American and the other's white. And yet so much of what has transpired around us has driven straight to the heart of the working class, of the poor class, of anything that's below upper middle class pretty much anymore. So, the ideas of what we carried with us traditionally, or what we had always heard, or what we thought when we were younger, suddenly becomes a truth that's almost too heavy to bear, almost too heavy to sift out. And so a lot of folks just won't. And they'll play golf on Sundays on a golf course that was once a family farm, or we'll go pretend like, our family was too poor to own slaves, or, I never participated in that. I had black friends in high school. And yet, what they don't realize is that the very place that they're holding is what has been sort of responsible for kind of tearing at that fabric of getting to truly understand who we are in that space. Now, I know I've just rambled through all of that stuff to simply say, or simply ask you to talk about what you have seen in terms of the way in which class and race oftentimes is, I almost think, pitted against one another, an antagonistic relationship when really it should be more of an allegiance.
So this latest, book dealt with race in ways that really none of my other work has. And, there were lots of reasons that went into why that became, kind of a prevailing theme of that novel. And one of the reasons is that, we've lived with this very long fallacy that rurality is a white experience.
Right.
Be rural is something that can only be white, and that black experiences is something that's completely an urban experience. Of course, we know that's not true, right?
Right.
It's not that the literature hasn't shown us that it's not true. You think about a writer like Randall Keenan, who I think is one of the greatest writers to ever come out of the state of North Carolina, who was writing about the rural black experience, in Eastern North Carolina. Or you think about Ernest Gaines, or you think about modern writers like Crystal Wilkinson or Natalie Basel. And that extends into Appalachia, right? Like, you ask somebody in California, what does Appalachia look like? Well, Appalachia looks like me. Like, it looks like a big, ugly white dude with a beard wearing camouflage, and boots. But what it doesn't look like is Mount Zion AME Church in Cullowhee, which is one of the oldest churches in this county. The idea of black mountain people is something that, for a lot of America, it doesn't exist. And so I think part of what that book was trying to do was to bear witness to that truth and try to You can't write about this place and ignore that. That relationship between race and class. I can remember having dinner with a woman named Selma Sparks that lives here locally. And Selma Sparks was a civil rights activist. She was from New York City, but she worked at the Liberator, like worked with James Baldwin, like led a march on the UN. Like, this woman lived this incredible life. But we were having a conversation about the civil rights movement, and I was just picking her brain. And at one point she said that the greatest failure was the failure to unite the interests of Black America with the interests of working class whites. And she was ultimately echoing, things that W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about in the late 1800s, which is to say, that after the Civil War, we had this very short-lived moment of Reconstruction where we had a real chance in this country to right the ship. And I would argue that it was working class whites who deliberately chose to not align themselves in that particular moment. And Reconstruction becomes a very short-lived moment in our history, and we usher in an era of Jim Crow that we're still living in the shadow of. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, yes, those things are just so tightly aligned in this country. And the minute that if you could ever reconcile those two things, the people with the money in their pockets would be in a lot of trouble. And so, having grown up with those ghosts, I think this book in a lot of ways was something that I had always been wanting to do.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the book we're talking about is Those We Thought We Knew, which came out in 2023. So I would encourage folks to grab that for sure. But in all of them, there are a lot of themes that roll through of class, family, and in some ways, in odd ways even sometimes, spirituality. When these mountains burn, for instance, family is a big part of what drives your main character to do what he needs to do in that book. And again, I'm trying not to spell all this stuff out, but the line that held us very clear, same thing. And then, of course, obviously where all light tends to go. So family is something that keeps coming back, or it bounces around, but it stays as sort of an integral part. And I was thinking about this exhibit. That's one of the themes in that is faith, family, and community. Most of the spaces that we see, these are right at the turn of the 20th century, more urban, but I would love to hear how you see those three things, maybe not just so much in your novels, but how you see that in the mountains in Western North Carolina. How does that manifest itself in spaces, whether they're interior or exterior? Because we are going to talk about exterior space. You are a man of the woods, and God love you for it, because that's going to make some sense when we talk about how we lived through the pandemic. But, talk a little bit about how faith, family, community works, and where you are, and maybe even how it even pops its way up in your novels.
Yes, I grew up, like I said, all of my father's family was in a very small place. I think my dad made it about 3 miles over the course of his, entire life. I grew up a mile down the road from an uncle who still kept rabbit dogs. I grew up less than that from a grandmother. There was never a week that went by that I wasn't, around my grandmother, around my uncle, around my aunt, around my cousins. We were just all right there. We were rooted to place. And I don't think that was something that was just, where I lived. Obviously not. It's the same thing. It's why I gravitated towards your work. It was something that I immediately recognized there. It's something that you immediately, recognize here in Jackson County. The very first thing somebody is going to ask you If right now Ray McManus came up here and you're in the truck with me and I'm sitting outside of a gun shop right now, that my best friend owns. And if I take you in there and all the old men that are always in there are sitting there, the very first thing they're going to ask you is what's your name? And what they mean isn't your name's Ray. What they mean is what's your surname? And you say McManus. And all of their faces are going to scrunch up because they're going to be trying to place you. And then they're going to say, I don't think I know any McManuses. Or if you go in there and you say, my last name's McCall, the first question might be, well, are you a Glenville McCall? Or are you a Little Canada McCall? Or are you a Balsam Grove McCall? Like the name attaches you to a place, and that's the type of places that I grew up in, and that's the type of place that I continue to live. But I think what we're witnessing is a disintegration of that. And when I say that we're losing it, I'm not just talking about rural America. I'm talking about America as a whole, and I'm talking about the world as a whole. How many people are even around their families anymore with any type of consistency? I was with someone recently, a buddy of mine, somebody I've known forever, and he was going to, he's in his 70s now, and he was going to visit his sister, and I just happened to say, well, when's the last time you saw your sister? And he said, 30 years ago. And when he said that, like my mind exploded, right? Like if I don't see like nowadays, I might go 6 months without seeing my sister, and that's a very long time. Mm-hmm. And those types of things, they don't exist anymore. No one is from the place where they're at. Their family's not from there. Like I grew up, in Charlotte on the river, in Paul Creek. Paul Creek doesn't exist anymore. Morris Chapel doesn't exist anymore. Steel Creek doesn't exist anymore. And I would venture to say that 95% of the people in the city of Charlotte, North Carolina are not from there. Mm-hmm. They're from all over. And, for a long time, it was like, I wanted to fight this. And I don't know that you can. Or at least I think that you're fighting a losing battle and you're fighting something that's inevitable. And in the end, it just makes me sad because what we're steadily marching towards, like I said, is a state of homogeny.
Right.
I don't think that the average person, they can't pick up the phone and make a phone call and have somebody there in an instant. Mm-hmm. Anymore, and I can say that here it does still exist, and I'm clinging to it desperately, but at the same time I recognize that it's dying with all of these old men in this gun shop.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was about to ask you. Do you feel like that there is a sense of urgency now because that generation is dying?
But this is another thing that I wrestle with deeply. Is that all of we're talking about all of these good things, these qualities that I admire and these qualities that I love that are dying out with a generation. And I think that we're witnessing the last of that generation. But what we're not discussing is that there were also a whole lot of bad things that were associated with that generation that are also dying out. So with people moving into these places, we're experiencing these diversity changes where suddenly, there's a pride parade in Sylva, North Carolina, or there's a drag show in Sylva, North Carolina. And, I wrestle very deeply with those two things. And I think that's, at the end of the day, that's kind of why I've settled on this side of indifference is that, things are just shifting and we're losing a lot of good things. But at the same time, I think we're gaining some good things as well.
Do you feel like is it may be incumbent on our generations. I'll have to say generations plural. I guess I'm Gen X and felt like I've been fighting boomers my whole life, and then now I've gotten older and realized, I was fighting against the right thing, but was kind of lumping a whole generation of people into that. And now, some of those things that I did not necessarily want to fight against are, we're losing and we might not get back. But I feel like if we're going to lose, what are we going to gain? And I think that's the part that I wrestle with now, is if that generation's gone, then it's going to be up to the next man up. Next one up has got to be the one that's got to pass that torch along. And I've domesticated a lot more. I'm working in academics and moved, well off the farms and stuff like that. But you are still very much a part and attuned to it. You hunt, you live with the land, and off it. So, I got to think, David, I think, your writings and the things that you talk about gives hope of the fact that even though the landscape around is going to change, there's still going to be something there that we can still cling to, hold on to as a part of ourselves. I still don't quite understand which mushrooms I can eat. But we went through the pandemic, and so many of us, we're trapped in our houses and that sort of thing. What was your space like during that time?
I think one of the things that I recognized so I'm sitting outside of this gun shop right now. It's owned by a guy who's, that's all he's ever done. He's owned this shop for 40 years. Close to 45 years. And he and I were in Florida turkey hunting when the pandemic first hit. I can remember us riding back, filling up gas at a gas station in Florida, watching the news on the gas pump as all of this stuff is unfolding. And I can remember, one of the very first things they wanted you to have, I can't remember, was it 2 weeks of food or was it a month of food or whatever, right? Like that, they said that's what you need. And my very first thought was, I've got enough food at my house right now for the entire year. And it's not just me. The majority of people that I know had enough food at their houses right then to last a year, because that's just how we live. We grow big gardens, we put up food, we hunt, we put up meat, we can meat, we freeze meat. My life didn't change for the most part, outside of the fact in some ways I became more accessible. And it was because of what we're doing right this minute, which was suddenly something like Zoom became a cultural norm. And then it was like, well, we'll just jump on a Zoom meet. And it was like, I don't have internet. I have to drive down the mountain. But yeah, when I look back, my life, it didn't really change that much. When I think about tying, all of those things that I love, hunting and fishing and gardening and putting things up, and I tie that into the larger conversation that you and I are having right now, one of the things that I wrestle with is that we've had multiple generations who it is their culture and they did not want it. Right. So you had parents who canned and grandparents who canned, and you had kids who had no, they didn't care and they didn't want to learn it. They didn't learn it. They don't hunt. They don't garden. They don't do anything, right? And then you have this influx of all of these, in my mind, hipsters who are moving into a place who do want to learn it and are learning it. And at first I was very dismissive of it. And there was, there was an extreme hesitancy to share any of it, because my initial instinct with outsiders is always that they're trying to exploit and they're trying to extract. But I think as time has gone on, I've started to wonder if that's the only way that it survives, is it worth carrying on? And I think that it is. I think that it is. In Appalachia, there was a long history of keeping beans in a way that they call leather breeches. You grow, beans, like long string beans, and you string them up with a needle and thread, and you hang these giant lines of them, and they dry hanging in your house. It was a preservation method. So when winter comes, you pull them off and you cook them, and it changes the texture, it changes the flavor, but you wind up with these wonderful beans in winter that you grew in summer. And I can just, that's something that's very indicative of Appalachia and very indicative of this place. And I can remember seeing 2 or 3 different people who weren't from here and have no relationship to here other than that they moved here, from Florida or from, New York or wherever. But all of them had grown gardens, and all of them had put up beans in a fashion that dated back hundreds of years. There's beauty in the fact that someone born of this place, whose family goes back here generations and generations, didn't give a shit about what his grandmother did enough to learn it. But now somebody that kid's same age has moved into this place and is begging her for that knowledge.
Right.
And you know me, and I'm not a very hopeful person, but that's probably the closest I can get to hopefulness.
Right. I mean, I don't see how you could not have hope in that, because the alternative is dire. I mean, and it gets very nihilistic. I mean, I just, and I feel like I'm kind of like you, as an angry young man, and hell bent on wanting to destroy it and burn it all down. There's a part of me, I'm too damn old and too damn tired, but maybe that's where my indifference is coming from. Well, Dave, before we wrap up, I wanted to, we've had some discussions earlier on this show about, how we use objects in our lives. There are the utilitarian type things that we rely on. There are some that we use objects as status symbols. They got to have the latest iPhone, or can't just be a pocketbook. It's got to be a $500 pocketbook or something like that, but thinking about how, whether we like it or not, there are objects that we have in our possession that do define us. Like, if I were not in this room, but I left my pack of cigarettes and my Coke, people would know it was mine. Like, they would know that was me, What objects would you say that defines you?
Probably my boots.
That was one I was thinking, actually.
And part of it is because I'm built like a monster, built like a giant Sasquatch. So the amount of leather it takes to make my boots, like, that's the first thing people see is my feet. But the bigger thing that I think your question is getting at, like, I think of it like in terms of, if you and I were had been important people in the old ages and they had built us a tomb, like, what would they have put in the tomb?
Yeah.
What would the archaeologists have found, around our body? Or what would they bury you with in your casket? Or if your house caught fire, what's the one thing you're grabbing? And for me, the first thing I'm grabbing is my grandmother's fishing rod. Right.
Yeah.
Like, I can remember her giving it to me when I was 10 years old. I mentioned this at one point in time a couple years ago, and I think most people would think that I was either being hyperbolic or, that I was making it up. But I said that fishing rod had probably caught over 1 million fish. And I don't mean that as an exaggeration. Like, I think about the number of fish that she caught, and I think about the number of 100 fish days that I had as a kid. There were years as a kid where I didn't miss a day fishing, and I caught 100 fish a day. So 10 days I was at 1,000. And so I mean that rod has probably caught 1 million fish and is still going. And it's like, that's the thing I would grab. I think about things too that are like important to me, and like, where would they go? Like, when I die, who gets this? And will they value it in the same way that I do? I have this, the topic you're bringing up is kind of a big one. We could do a whole damn podcast on it, which is that I'm just an incredibly sentimental person when it comes to objects. And like, the things that I value aren't things that are monetarily valuable. Mm-hmm. Like right now I'm sitting outside of this gun shop, and I can tell you flat out, if that man right there died, I know one of the things that I want is the vice that's on his workbench. Mm-hmm. And it's not that it's valuable. It's that for 40 years he sat there and his hands have been on it every day of his life. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the type of stuff that I value. And so for me, it's things like that fishing rod, it's things like turkey calls. But the thing that somebody's going to see and say, yep, David's been here, are my big ass boots.
David Joy is the author of Those We Thought We Knew in 2023. When These Mountains Burn, winner of the 2020 Dashiell Hammett Award. The Line That Held Us, winner of the 2018 Southern Books Prize. The Weight of This World and Where All Light Tends to Go, an Edgar finalist for Best First Novel. His stories and creative nonfiction have appeared in a number of publications, and he is the author of the memoir Growing Gills, A Fly Fisherman's Journey, and a co-editor of Gather at the River, 25 authors on fishing. David lives in Tuckasegee, North Carolina, and he's my friend. When you think about how we relate to interior spaces, you really can't ignore the fact that by focusing on interior spaces, so much of that is a direct result of exterior spaces. And the way the objects that we hold, whether they are things that we use, whether they are status symbols, whether they are heirlooms that we have that occupy these spaces with us, it's good for us to remember that without context, these objects cannot necessarily speak for themselves. They're a part of us. And so as we look back and as we look forward, I think it's good that we realize that relationship, because we're all in the same space together. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted by me, Ray McManus, produced and edited by Drew Barron, with special assistance from Joel Ryan Cook. For more information about CMA exhibitions and programs, visit our website at www.columbiamuseum.org.
When I was in my office and I was coming up with this idea the weather's nasty, we'll do like a weather thing. I was like, a podcast that's just about the weather. I was like, I don't know how no one has made that yet.
I know, right?
Oh, yeah, I felt a breeze earlier. Can you believe that?
Yeah, right.
This is going to be a hit, dude.
Yeah, we're going to do it.
Talking about Ray and Drew talk about the weather.
Yeah.